Imagine a world locked in ice, a world where the very air you exhale freezes into a fine, crystalline dust. This is not a scene from a fantasy novel. This is Europe, 15,000 years before the present day. The great ice sheets of the last glacial maximum are retreating, but their grip on the land remains absolute. In this sub-zero realm, survival is measured in calories and warmth. For a small band of hunter-gatherers, fire is not a convenience. It is the pulsating, flickering heart of life itself. It is what stands between them and the ravenous cold. But what happens when that heart falters? When the world is sodden, when every twig is encased in a sleeve of ice, and the very tinder you carry is damp? How do you coax a spark into a flame when the elements themselves seem determined to snuff it out? This is the story of a lost art, a forgotten mastery that meant the difference between life and extinction. This is the story of how, against all odds, the first fires were born in the deepest cold. The wind did not howl. It was a low, constant moan that seeped through the hides stretched across the lodge entrance. Inside, the world was a tapestry of shadow and feeble, trembling orange light. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, curing meat, and the profound, earthy scent of humanity huddled together. At the center of the semi-subterranean dwelling, a fire smoldered on a bed of stones and hardened earth. Its light danced across the faces of the people, highlighting the deep lines of hardship on the elder, Boar's face, and the wide, fearful eyes of the children. Rokan, a man in the prime of his years, with shoulders broad from a life of hunting the great woolly mammoth, knelt by the fire. His hands, scarred and strong, carefully fetted a precious piece of dried lichen. The flame licked at it, flared for a precious moment, then settled back into a sullen glow. The fire was dying. It had been dying for days, its vitality leaching away as the unending dampness outside permeated everything. "It cannot last another night," Boar said, his voice a dry rustle. He did not look at Rokan, but at the fire, as if speaking to the spirit within. "The life-giver grows weak. The world is too wet." Rokan nodded, his jaw tight. He was the keeper of the flame, a title passed from father to son for more generations than the stories could recall. His entire life was a ritual centered on this single, vital point of heat and light. He carried the embers in a special horn lined with clay and dry moss when the tribe moved. He knew which woods burned long and hot, which fungi would catch a spark, how to bank the coals to last until dawn. But this was different. This was a pervasive, insidious wetness that defied all his usual skills. The resinous pine knots they normally relied on hissed and spat, refusing to catch properly. The kindling was limp with moisture. "The world is drowning in cold water," Ella, Rokan's mate, whispered, drawing a fur tighter around their sleeping daughter. Her words hung in the air, a truth they all felt in their bones. Failure was not an option. A tribe without fire was a dead tribe. They would perish from the cold in a single, brutal night, or, weakened and shivering, they would fall prey to the great cave lions or the packs of dire wolves that haunted the frozen valleys. Fire was their sun in the endless night, their protector, their cook, their tool maker. It was the soul of their community. Rokan's gaze swept the lodge, meeting the anxious eyes of the other hunters, the weary resignation of the elders. He saw the unspoken question in all of them. What would the keeper do? He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. "The old ways are not enough," he announced, his voice steady, though a knot of fear tightened in his stomach. "The life-giver is starving. I must find it new food. I must find the fire that lives where no fire should." Boar's old eyes met his. There was no criticism in them, only a deep, ancestral worry. The stories, the old stories from when the world was even colder. They speak of a stone that holds a star within, and of a fungus that drinks fire. The others looked skeptical. They were practical people. They believed in what they could see, what they could touch, the thrust of a spear, the taste of cooked meat, the warmth of a healthy flame. Stories were for the long nights, not for moments of crisis. But Rokan was listening. Desperation was a sharpening stone for the mind. "Where?" he asked simply. Boar gestured vaguely towards the entrance, towards the unforgiving world outside, where the high rocks tear the sky, where the earth's bones are laid bare. But the way is treacherous, and the knowledge is a ghost, A whisper. That was all Roken needed. He stood up, his decision made. He gathered his tools, a sharp flint blade, a heavy hammerstone, a roll of dried sinew, and a pouch. Into this pouch, he carefully placed the last, largest ember from the fire, nestled in a cradle of bone-dry, crumbled punk fungus from the very center of their storage. It was a desperate gamble. He would either return with the secret to a new fire, or he would not return at all, and the ember he carried would die with him, sealing the tribe's fate. As he pushed aside the heavy hide door and stepped out into the blinding white-gray world, the cold struck him like a physical blow. The wind snatched his breath. He pulled his hood of wolf fur tighter and began to climb, away from the relative shelter of the valley, towards the jagged limestone cliffs that Boar had spoken of. He was chasing a ghost, a whisper from a forgotten age, with the last warmth of his people cradled against his chest. The world outside the lodge was a study in monochrome agony. The wind, now unfettered by the hide doorway, was a scalpel of ice, carving through Rokan's furs as if they were nothing. Each step was a battle. The snow, crusted over from a brief midday thaw and then refrozen, cracked under his weight, sometimes holding, sometimes plunging his leg knee-deep into a powder-filled void. He moved with the weary, deliberate pace of a man who knew that haste wasted energy, and energy was heat, and heat was life itself. His destination was the place of the sky stones, a jagged spine of limestone cliffs a half-day's trek to the east. It was a land of upheaval where glaciers had scraped the earth raw and retreating ice had left behind a chaotic jumble of rocks and precarious scree slopes. The tribe rarely ventured there. It was a place of poor hunting, exposed to the elements, and home only to sure-footed ibex and the spirits of the high, lonely places. But Boar's stories insisted it was also a place of power, where the bones of the earth were exposed and secrets slept in the stone. As he climbed, his mind was not on the spirits, but on the ember. He could feel its faint vital warmth through the leather of his pouch, a tiny beating heart against his own. Every few hundred paces, he would stop in the lee of a boulder or a stunted, wind-twisted pine, open the pouch, and gently feed the ember a pinch of the precious dry punk fungus. He would watch, his breath pluming in the air as the material blackened and glowed, a minuscule sun in the palm of his hand. It was a ritual of profound focus, a single gust of wind, a moment of clumsiness, and it would be over. The landscape was a testament to water's tyranny. What wasn't frozen solid was slick with a thin, invisible film of ice. Every branch, every rock, every tuft of frozen grass was encased in a glassy shell. He tried, as an experiment, to gather some of the birch bark that usually made excellent tinder. It peeled away in his fingers, sodden and limp, tearing like rotten cloth. The very concept of dryness seemed a memory from another, kinder world. His thoughts drifted to the stories Boar told by the fire, tales of the long winter, when the ice was a wall to the south, and the ancestors had to be cleverer than the cold. They spoke of a sunstone, a heavy, dull gray rock that, when struck with another stone, would throw out a shower of bright, hot sparks. And they spoke of the fire sponge, a hard, woody fungus that grew on the sides of birch trees, which could catch those sparks and hold them, smoldering for a long, long time, even when damp. Rokan had always listened to these tales with a child's ear, as fanciful myths. Now, as he struggled for survival, they were no longer stories. They were a set of instructions, a manual for life. The ancestors weren't just entertaining. They were passing down a survival code for a specific terrible set of circumstances that had now returned. After hours of arduous travel, he reached the base of the cliffs. The air was even colder here, funneled and accelerated by the rock faces. He scanned the talus slope, his eyes searching for anything that matched the descriptions. He saw plenty of stone, flint nodules, common sandstone, granite, but nothing that looked special. Despair began to creep into the edges of his consciousness, colder than the wind. Had he doomed his people on a fool's errand? Then his eyes caught a glint, not a sparkle, but a peculiar, dull, metallic sheen on a chunk of rock that had split open, revealing its inner face. It was heavier than it looked when he picked it up, and its color was a dark, brassy gray. His heart hammered against his ribs. The sunstone? He found a piece of common flint, and, with a prayer to the spirits of the mountain, struck the two together. A sharp clack echoed in the silent expanse. And then, nothing. No spark. Just a fresh chip on the flint. The hope that had flared in him died just as quickly. He tried again and again, altering the angle, the force. Each failure was a small death. Perhaps the stories were wrong. Perhaps the knowledge was truly lost. Frustrated, he slammed the two rocks together with all his strength. This time, a shower of tiny, white-hot points of light erupted from the point of impact, sizzling briefly in the air before vanishing. They were not the weak orange sparks of flint on flint. These were brighter, hotter, more aggressive. He had found it. The Sunstone. The ancestors had not lied. But the spark was only half the battle. It was a fleeting, brilliant moment that needed a home. He needed the fire sponge. He looked up at the skeletal, white-barked birch trees clinging to the cliff face, their branches rattling in the wind like bones. And there, on a dead trunk, he saw it, a hard, hoof-shaped growth, its surface a concentric pattern of grays and browns. The fire sponge. The final piece of the puzzle was within reach, clinging to a sheer rock face, high above him. The wind moaned its challenge. The sight of the fungus, the fire sponge, was a beacon of hope, but the path to it was a vertical wall of treachery. The limestone cliff was a mosaic of icy holds and brittle outcrops. One misstep, one handhold torn loose by his weight, and he would join the scattered bones of ibex at the base of the scree slope. The ember in his pouch felt heavier than ever, a tangible weight of responsibility. He could not fail. He shed his heavy outer furs, leaving them in a pile at the base, knowing the climb would require a flexibility that the stiff, frozen hides would not allow. The cold bit into his core immediately, but he embraced it, needing the sharp, clear focus it brought. His fingers wrapped in thin, supple leather sought out cracks and ridges, testing each one before trusting his life to it. The wind plucked at him, a constant, malevolent force trying to pry him from the rock face. Every movement was a calculated risk. He dug the toes of his boots into minute ledges, his muscles burning with the strain. His world shrank to the few feet of rock in front of his face. The chatter of the tribe, the worried eyes of his daughter, the dying fire, all of it faded into a distant hum, secondary to the immediate, primal need to climb. Time lost its meaning. There was only the next handhold, the next foothold. After what felt like an age, he hauled himself onto a narrow ledge just below the cluster of birch trees. The fire sponge was within arm's reach. It was larger than he had imagined from below, a tough, woody conch that seemed to have grown from the very heart of the dead tree. He drew his flint blade and began to work, carefully cutting away at the point where the fungus met the bark. It was astonishingly hard, like trying to carve stone. Chips of it flew away, and he carefully gathered them into his pouch. He needed a substantial piece, a core that could host the spark and nurture it into life. Finally, with a last, grating cut, a section the size of his hand broke free. It was surprisingly light for its density. He held it to his nose. It had a faint, earthy, almost mushroom-like scent. This was it, the legendary fire sponge, the material that, according to Bohr, could drink a spark and hold it like a secret, smoldering for hours without bursting into flame, immune to the damp that plagued everything else. The descent was, if anything, more perilous than the ascent. Fatigue was setting in, his muscles trembling with exhaustion and the deep, penetrating cold. But he moved with a new purpose. The weight of the fungus and the sunstone in his pouch a potent antidote to despair. He reached the base, his body screaming in protest, and hastily pulled his outer furs back on, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. He did not rest. The light was fading, and the ember he carried was growing weaker with every passing moment. He needed to perform the ritual now. He scrambled into a small, shallow cave at the base of the cliffs, a mere indentation in the rock, but it offered shelter from the direct assault of the wind. Inside the semi-darkness, his movements became a sacred focus ceremony. First, he prepared a nest. He scraped together a small pile of the driest materials he could find, the inner, papery bark from a dead birch trunk he had spotted, some bone-dry grass protected from the elements under a rock overhang, and a handful of the wood shavings he had carved from the fire sponge. This nest was the cradle, the womb where the new fire would be born. Then he took the piece of fire sponge and, with his flint blade, began to scrape its surface vigorously. He wasn't trying to create kindling. He was creating a fine, fluffy dust. Bohr's stories had been very specific on this point. The magic was not in the chunk itself, but in the hair of the fire sponge, the tinder-like material that could be scraped from its underside. He worked quickly, creating a small pile of this fibrous, brownish dust right in the center of his tinder nest. The moment of truth had arrived. The ember in his horn was now little more than a faint orange pinprick, gasping its last. He had one chance. He took the sunstone in his left hand and a hard piece of flint in his right. He positioned the edge of the flint against the sunstone, aiming directly for the small pile of fire sponge dust. He took a deep, steadying breath, his entire world narrowing to the space between the two stones. He thought of Ela's face, of his daughter's smile, of the warmth of the lodge, and then, with a sharp, decisive motion, he struck the flint down and across the face of the sunstone. A cascade of brilliant, white-hot sparks erupted from the point of impact, far more vivid and energetic than any he had seen from flint alone. They showered onto the prepared dust. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then he saw it, a single minuscule point of orange light, like the first star in a twilight sky. It landed on a particle of the fire sponge dust. It did not fade, it grew. A wisp of smoke, so thin it was almost invisible, curled upwards. Then another. The spark was not dying, it was feeding. It was crawling, slowly, deliberately, through the dust, turning it from brown to black, leaving a glowing trail in its wake. The fire sponge was living up to its name. It was not catching fire, it was holding the fire within itself, a slow, persistent burn that the damp air could not extinguish. Roken leaned forward, his breath held, and began to blow on it, gently, steadily, as if coaxing a shy animal from its den. The glow intensified. He added more of the scrapings, then finer pieces of the birch bark. The glow spread, consuming the offerings. He nurtured it, his hands cupped around the nascent life, feeding it larger and larger pieces of tinder, until, with a soft whoomp, a tiny, defiant yellow flame burst into existence. It was small. It was fragile. But it was alive. He had not carried fire from the old lodge. He had birthed new fire from the very bones of the earth and the flesh of the trees. In that moment, kneeling in a frozen cave, Rokan was more than just the keeper of the flame. He was its creator. The journey back was a pilgrimage of fire. The tiny, resilient flame, cradled in a makeshift torch of tightly bound birch bark and resinous pine knots, was more precious than any mammoth tusk or cache of fine flint. It was a living thing, and Rokan was its protector. He moved through the twilight world not as a desperate man chasing a ghost, but as a vessel of profound power. The wind still tore at him. The snow still tried to swallow his feet, but these were now mere inconveniences. He carried a piece of the sun in his hands. He could feel the change in the very air around him. The oppressive, silent weight of the frozen landscape was pushed back by the sphere of warmth and crackling light that surrounded him. Once, a pair of glowing eyes, a cave hyena drawn by the unusual light, appeared at the edge of the darkness, but it did not approach. The fire, this new, unnatural element moving through the night, was something it did not understand, and therefore, something it feared. The flame was not just a tool for warmth, it was a shield, a declaration of dominion against the primal night. As he neared the valley of his people, a new anxiety began to gnaw at him. He had the secret. He had the sunstone and the fire sponge. But could he teach it? The knowledge felt sacred, personal, earned through near death and sheer force of will. In the old ways, the fire was a continuous lineage, a single thread passed from one keeper to the next. This was different. This was the ability to summon fire from nothingness, to create life from cold stone. This knowledge could change the balance of everything. Who would be worthy of such a gift? He pushed aside the hide door of the lodge. The scene inside was one of profound despair. The central fire was dead. Not low, not smoldering, but a cold, black pit of ash. The air was frigid, far colder than outside without the wind, and thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and dread. The tribe was huddled together in a single, shivering mass of furs, their faces pale and etched with the certainty of their own demise. Ella looked up, her eyes hollow. She saw the torch in his hand, and for a moment there was no recognition, only a dull confusion at the strange dancing light. Then Boar, from the depths of the huddle, let out a gasp that was half a sob. "The life giver!" he croaked. "You brought it back!" A ripple of movement went through the tribe, heads lifted, eyes wide with disbelief, fixed on the flame. Rokan did not speak. He walked to the cold hearth, knelt, and with a reverence usually reserved for a burial, he transferred the flame from his torch to the waiting pyre of wood that had been prepared in vain hope. The fire, hungry and confident, leaped onto the dry fuel. It caught, it grew, it roared to life, flooding the lodge with light and heat that felt in that moment like a miracle. The transformation was instantaneous and profound. The shivering stopped. Color returned to faces. The children, who had been listless and quiet, began to murmur with awe. The tribe, moments from the abyss, was pulled back into the world of the living by that single, powerful act. Later, when the fear had subsided and the warmth had seeped back into their bones, Rokan told them the story. He showed them the sunstone, the heavy, unassuming piece of iron pyrite. He showed them the chunk of fire sponge, the foam's fomentarious fungus. He demonstrated the scraping, the creation of the dust, the striking of the stone. He showed them how to coax the spark into a glow and the glow into a flame. He saw the understanding dawn in their eyes. It was not magic, it was a skill, a difficult, precise skill, but a skill nonetheless. It was a knowledge that could be learned, practiced, and mastered. The fire was no longer a fragile heirloom to be guarded by one man. It was a potential that lived in the very landscape around them, waiting to be unlocked. This was the true revolution. It was not merely the creation of fire in a wet environment. It was the democratization of creation itself. The tribe was no longer utterly dependent on the continuity of a single flame. They could lose their fire 100 times, and 100 times they could call it back from the stone and the fungus. This knowledge granted them a new kind of resilience, a new confidence to explore wetter, colder territories, to survive disasters that would have exterminated them before. Rokan the Keeper had become Rokan, the teacher, and in teaching he ensured that the art would not be lost. It would be passed down, from parent to child, for generations. It would become part of the tribe's identity, a foundational myth of their own ingenuity. The secret of the sunstone and the fire sponge would travel with them, a silent, powerful engine driving the human story forward into the most challenging corners of the Ice Age world. The days that followed were not a return to the old ways, but the dawn of a new era. The lodge was warm again, but the atmosphere was charged with a new energy, the energy of practice and mastery. Rokan was no longer the sole guardian of a fragile ember. He was the head of a school. The central fire, now a robust and crackling giant, served as both a comfort and a classroom. He gathered the hunters, the most dexterous and patient among them, and began the meticulous instruction. The process was far from simple. It was a ritual of precision. First, they had to learn to identify the sunstone. Not every heavy brassy rock was iron pyrite. They learned to look for the perfect cubic crystals, the specific heft, the way it rang with a certain tone when struck. They amassed a small cache of it, a greater treasure than any store of food. Then came the preparation of the fire sponge. This was an art in itself. They learned that not all of the fungus was equal. The best part was the tough, fibrous inner layer, the amadou, which had to be painstakingly separated from the harder outer crust. This amadou then had to be processed. They experimented, discovering that by pounding it with a smooth stone, they could break down its fibers, making it more receptive to a spark. Some even began soaking it in a solution of wood ash and water, then letting it dry, a primitive form of nitration that made it catch even more readily. They were no longer just users of nature. They were engineers, manipulating materials to suit their needs. The striking technique was the final, crucial step. It was not a wild, frantic bashing of rocks. It was a controlled, sharp, glancing blow. The flint striker had to be held at just the right angle to shave a microscopic sliver off the pyrite, a sliver that, heated instantly to thousands of degrees by the impact, became the spark. They practiced for hours, their hands cramping, the sharp clack, clack, clack of stone on stone becoming the soundtrack of their salvation. Failed sparks were met with grunts of frustration. A successful one that landed on the prepared amadou and began to smolder was met with a quiet, profound reverence. Ella, too, embraced the new knowledge. While the men practiced with the stones, she took charge of the tinder kit. She curated a special pouch containing not just the prepared amadou, but also a variety of other drought-resistant tinders, crumbled birch polypore fungus, certain dried mosses, and the fluffy seeds of the fireweed plant. She became an archivist of ignition, understanding that redundancy was the key to reliability. If one tinder failed, another would catch. This decentralization of knowledge transformed the tribe's dynamics. The keeper of the flame was no longer a solitary figure bearing the weight of the world on his shoulders. The responsibility and the power was now shared. A hunting party could venture further, stay out longer, confident that even if a storm soaked their emergency ember, they could create a new fire from the materials in their kits. They could build temporary shelters in the high passes, secure in the knowledge that they could bring the life-giver with them into the very heart of the cold. One evening, a young hunter named Kir, who had been particularly adept at the new skill, approached Rokan by the fire. In his hands he held a newly crafted object. It was a section of a hollowed-out leg bone, sealed at one end with a plug of pine resin. Inside, nestled together, was a small piece of iron pyrite, a flint striker, and a generous portion of Ela's prepared amadou. "Look, Rokan," Kir said, his voice filled with pride. "I can carry the making of it, not just the fire itself, but the making." Rokan took the kit, turning it over in his hands. It was more than a tool, it was a symbol. It was a portable factory for survival, a compact embodiment of their collective intelligence. He looked at Kir's face, alight with the confidence that comes from self-reliance, and he knew that the tribe had crossed a threshold. They were no longer merely surviving the harsh conditions of their world. They were beginning to master them. The lost art was lost no more. It had been rediscovered, refined, and was now being woven into the very fabric of their culture, ready to be carried into an uncertain future. The mastery of pyrite and fungus did more than just ensure survival. It rewrote the very map of the possible. With the confidence of a people who could conjure fire from the frozen landscape itself, the tribe began to look upon their world with new eyes. The treacherous high passes that had once been barriers became potential corridors. The river valleys, shrouded in freezing fog, were no longer just traps of dampness, but pathways to new hunting grounds. The knowledge of fire-making was a key, and it was unlocking the continent. This was not a conscious decision of exploration, but a gradual, inevitable expansion. A hunting party, following the trail of reindeer further than ever before, was caught by a sudden blizzard. In the past, this would have been a death sentence. Now, they simply found a leeward rock face, dug a shallow snow pit, and within minutes had a small, hot fire blazing, using the kits they all carried. They survived the night, their bodies warmed, their spirits undaunted. When they returned, they spoke not of a narrow escape, but of the vast, untouched herds they had seen in the new valley beyond the pass. The stories spread, fueling a quiet revolution. The tribe, once tightly bound to a specific territory defined by the range they could travel while preserving their central fire, began to loosen its roots. They started to send out scouting parties, small groups equipped with the new technology, tasked not just with hunting, but with seeing what lay beyond the known horizons. Rokan, now graying at the temples, but with eyes that held a deep, hard-won wisdom, watched this change with a complex mix of pride and melancholy. The role that had defined his life, the solitary keeper, was evolving into something else. He was now a lore master, a keeper of knowledge rather than just a keeper of flame. He spent his days teaching the children how to identify the fire sponge on the birch trees, showing them the precise angle for the striking technique, and telling the story of his climb to the sky stones. The myth was being institutionalized, becoming the foundational epic of their people. One evening, as a council of elders and hunters debated the merits of moving the entire tribe to a new, richer valley 2 days' journey to the south, Boar, whose memory was now fading in and out like a guttering candle, spoke with sudden, startling clarity. "The long winter is not just a story from the past," the old man whispered, his voice carrying through the lodge. "It is a wheel that turns. The cold will return. It always does. But now, we do not have to fear it. We can follow the sun, follow the herds. We are no longer children of this single valley. We are children of the fire, and the fire can live anywhere. His words hung in the air, a profound truth that settled deep into their souls. They were shedding a territorial identity for a technological one. Their tribe was no longer defined by a place, but by a skill, a shared, powerful knowledge that granted them mobility and resilience. The decision was made. They would break camp at the next new moon and journey south. There was no panic, no desperate fear of the unknown. There was only purposeful preparation. Tools were mended, furs were sorted, and food was packed. And in every pack, in every pouch, were the essential tools: a piece of sunstone, a flint striker, and a bundle of the precious life-giving fire sponge. On the morning of the departure, Roken stood before the lodge one last time. The central fire inside had been allowed to die, its purpose served. He felt no sorrow watching the last tendrils of smoke rise into the crisp air. He looked at his people, his daughter now, a strong young woman with her own fire-making kit, the hunters confident and ready, the elders hopeful. They were not fleeing, they were advancing, carrying their greatest discovery with them. He turned his back on the old home and took his place at the head of the column. They moved south, not as refugees from the cold, but as pioneers armed with an ancient rediscovered art. The lost secret of the wet and freezing environment had not just saved them, it had set them in motion. It was a spark that would, in time, help humanity spread across the globe, into every niche and corner of a world emerging from ice. Generations flowed like the meltwater rivers, carving new channels through the ice-scoured land. The story of Rokan, the sky stones, and the fire sponge softened at the edges, its sharp details worn smooth by countless retellings around countless fires. It became the song of the first spark, an epic chant recited during the long winter nights, its rhythm mimicking the striking of stone on stone. Rokan was no longer just a man. He was a culture hero, a demigod who had stolen the secret of fire-making from the jealous spirits of the cold mountains. The tribe, now a confederation of bands, had flourished in the southern valleys. The land was richer, the winters marginally less brutal, but the knowledge was never forgotten. It was too vital, too deeply woven into their identity. The fire-making kit was a universal possession, as essential as a spear or a skinning knife. It was given to children when they came of age, a tangible symbol of their responsibility to the community and their mastery over their environment. In one of these new settlements, a young girl named Anya sat with her grandfather, the direct great-grandson of Kier, the hunter who had first crafted the portable kit. She was practicing her strikes, the clack-clack of her flint on a piece of pyrite, a familiar, comforting sound in the warm evening air. A spark flew, landed on her small pile of amadou, and died. Again, her grandfather said gently. Remember the song. A sharp blow, a glancing flight, a star is born in the deepest night. Anya struck again. This time, a spark caught. A tiny worm of orange light began to crawl through the tinder. She leaned forward, her small hands cupping it, and blew with a soft, steady breath, just as the song instructed. The glow brightened, and a wisp of smoke, sweet and earthy, curled upwards. "I did it," she whispered, her eyes wide with awe, not just at the fire, but at the connection she felt to the long chain of her ancestors who had performed this exact same ritual. Her grandfather smiled, his wrinkled face crinkling. "You have called the life-giver. Now you are truly one of the people." This was the true enduring legacy of Rokan's desperate quest. It wasn't just the survival of a single tribe during a harsh season. It was the creation of a self-perpetuating cycle of knowledge and empowerment, each successful. Fire-making was a reenactment of the founding myth, a physical prayer that reinforced their shared history and capabilities. The art was not stored in a single mind or a sacred text. It was stored in the muscle memory of every individual, in the songs they sang, and in the kits they carried. The world continued to change. The great ice retreated further, and forests of oak and hazel began to claim the open tundra. New challenges arose, new animals to hunt, new materials to shape. But the fundamental revolutionary truth remained. Humanity no longer needed to be tethered to a hearth. They carried the means of creation with them. This portable, reliable fire allowed for the development of more complex tools through heat treatment of stone, for the protection from new predators in wooded lands, and for the confidence to navigate a changing world. The specific technique of pyrite and fungus would, in millennia to come, be supplemented and then superseded by the bow drill and eventually by the flint and steel. But the principle, the ability to create fire at will in almost any condition, remained the bedrock of human advancement. It was a cognitive leap as significant as the first stone tool. It was the moment humanity declared itself an active force in nature, not merely its subject. The story of that winter, 15,000 years ago, faded from direct memory, absorbed into the substrate of myth. But the knowledge, refined and passed down from a father to a daughter, from a master to an apprentice, never truly vanished. It was there in every campfire that pushed back the darkness, in every hearth that defined a home. It was the quiet, persistent, glowing ember of human ingenuity, carried forward through time, ensuring that no matter how harsh the environment, the spark of civilization would never be extinguished. The lost art was lost no more. It had become a part of us. We hope you have enjoyed this journey into a pivotal moment in our deep history. The struggle for survival forged the ingenuity that defines our species. If you wish to explore more of these forgotten truths, these turning points where humanity stared into the abyss and responded with brilliance, we invite you to subscribe to our channel, Historical Truth. Until next time, when we unearth another secret from the dust of ages,